All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Welcome for joining us. I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the executive director for the NACBS, and this event is part of our NACBS book series. So I encourage anyone that's got upcoming publications to get in touch if you'd like to participate. Today, we're joined by Amy Watson and Peter Mancall, and I'm just going to briefly introduce them and then turn it over to them to get started. Amy's going to speak about the book briefly, and there will be time for Q&A at the end, so go ahead and save your questions, and then you can raise your Zoom hand whenever that gets started. So today we are joined by Amy Watson, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She was previously a postdoctoral fellow in the history of the early modern Americas at the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute. Her research has been supported by the Massachusetts Historical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, and the Library Company of Philadelphia, among others. She has published in the William and Mary Quarterly and the Scottish Historical Review, and Patriots Before Revolution, The Rise of Party Politics in the British Atlantic, 1714 to 1763, which we will be hearing about today, is her first book. And she'll be in discussion with Peter Mancall, who is Distinguished Professor, Andrew W. Mellon Professor of the Humanities, Professor of History, Anthropology, and Economics, and the Linda and Harlan Martins Director of the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute. He's the author of 7 books, including Nature and Culture in the Early Modern Atlantic in 2018, Fatal Journey, The Final Expedition of Henry Hudson in 2009, Hakluyt's Promise, and Elizabethan's Obsession for an English America in 2007, Deadly Medicine, Indians and Alcohol in Early America, 1995, and most recently, The Trials of Thomas Morton, an Anglican Lawyer in 2019. He's currently writing Troubled Continent, which will be volume 1 of the Oxford History of the United States. And so I will turn it over to Amy to get started briefly about the book.
Great. First, thank you so much, Amanda, for the lovely introduction and for organizing this event. Thanks so much to Peter for moderating, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I know many of you have heard a lot about this project before, and I could not have written this book without having such a supportive community around me. So thank you, sincerely. Okay, to start off, most Americans know that the revolutionaries who fought for American independence, people like Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, they all called themselves patriots. So with Patriots Before Revolution, I really set out to explain where these patriots came from and what this term actually meant in the 18th century British Atlantic world. In this book, I argue that the term patriot had a very specific partisan meaning that can be traced back to the beginning of the 18th century. In the 17 teens and 20s, the label was adopted by a group of reformist politicians who stood opposed to the Whig ministry headed by Britain's first prime minister, Sir Robert Walpole. And I argue that patriotism's original mission was not American Revolution or independence, but instead British imperial reform. Patriots sought to create an empire that was militant, expansionist, confederal, and free. So patriots strove to bolster Atlantic trade and to grow Atlantic industry and to better protect the rights of British Atlantic subjects. To implement this political program, Patriot politicians built the first empire-wide political party, using new tools of party organization, especially print media and newspapers, to reach as many people as possible throughout the Atlantic world. Now, the first half of my book focuses on the rise of patriotism through 4 geographic case studies, looking at England, Scotland, New York, and Georgia. The second half of the book then takes a step back to look at how this Patriot Party shaped the imperial wars of the mid-18th century, especially the War of Jenkins' Ear and the 7 Years' War. Let me just end this little overview by explaining one of my larger goals for this book. Basically, why do I think that the Patriots matter? Well, my biggest goal was to tell a more partisan and a more Atlantic origin story for the American Revolution. This book shows first that to fully understand the origins of the Revolution, you really need to go back to the early 18th century. Very, very few histories of the American Revolution begin before 1763. This conflict did not come out of nowhere in the 1760s and 70s. Instead, it came from decades of political contestation over economic policy and civil liberties, and what kind of empire Britain should strive to create. Second, this book shows that to fully understand the origins of the revolution, you have to understand British party politics of the era. After all, American revolutionaries used a partisan language. They called themselves patriots. They called their opponents Tories. This was not a coincidence. It was because they viewed this struggle as one between opposing partisan visions of what the British Empire should be. Okay, so that's my book in a little nutshell. I'm now going to turn it over to Peter. So again, thank you all for being here today.
Hi, Amy. Thanks for that. That was a great overview. You hit some of the key concepts of the book. So I just thought I would get us started by sort of asking you. I have a bunch of questions, but one of them is I just want to start with, and I know the book is new, but with kind of the reception of the book, that is the word patriot and patriotism uh, is tossed around constantly in our society today.
Right.
More often, it seems, by people on one side of the political spectrum than the other. Now, I could be misreading that, but that is sort of my sense. And I'm just curious if you see what kind of parallels you see between your definition of these patriots and how the term is commonly used today.
Yeah, great question. Certainly that was already in the air a little bit when I started conceiving of this book. So that influenced a little bit why I was interested in writing about the Patriots. I guess I would argue that, yeah, obviously the right seems to take this term as their own quite a lot, calling themselves Patriots. Although New England has a football team called the Patriots, and they don't tend to be quite as rightist, so maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. Um, Really, during the 18th century, I think that the political party spectrum was a little bit different than ours today, obviously. And there are certain elements that the right would probably really be excited about with the Patriot movement. They're extremely militant, for example. They are oftentimes trying to start wars with France and Spain at the slightest little provocation. They think that war is something that is going to bring economic security and prosperity to the British Empire as a tool they can kind of use. On other ways, though, really the Patriots are really trying to protect civil liberties that people on the right today don't seem to be quite as interested in, perhaps. Things like habeas corpus, for example. There's a chapter in my book that looks at habeas corpus and how this became a huge partisan issue in the 18th century, that the Patriots, especially William Pitt in England, were trying to pass a bill in Parliament that would secure the right of habeas corpus for impressed sailors during this time period. And so, really, it's hard to kind of push this on one partisan spectrum or the other. I want to tell a very historically specific story of the 18th century, where this movement came from, and try to show us that patriots had a very important meeting in the context of the 18th century.
Okay. Well, it seems to me, and part of your telling that story is that you're trying to both um, define a political system of beliefs that you think has been understudied. And at the same time, it seems to me, and I think this is pretty clear in your introduction, you sort of want to go after sort of the legacies of this idea that 18th century British politics was stable, right?
Right.
That you want to
Definitely.
get more contested. So can you expand on that a little bit? I'm not trying to, I joke with you before, this is not your qualifying exam.
Yeah, of course.
But
Yeah.
it does seem to me that you were trying to shift the way we think about British politics in the 18th century.
Definitely. So, some of you may know this already, but there is the kind of the traditional narrative of 18th century British politics is that this was an era of political stability, that this was an era of oligarchy and aristocracy. There's a very famous book by J.H. Plum called The Growth of Political Stability, in which he argues that after the rage of party during the early 18th century under Queen Anne, as well as obviously the very kind of violent conflicts with the Glorious Revolution in the late 17th century, Robert Walpole comes in and he gives something that people are really craving. He gives stability, he gives one party rule. Everyone is very satisfied with this idea, and these rage of party, it sort of disappears. Now, there's another kind of corollary, I would say, in American historiography of this period called the salutary neglect sort of story. And that is that the Whigs in charge of the government, they were happy to ignore empire for the most part, as long as it was bringing profits into British coffers. So American colonists were allowed to kind of govern themselves as they wanted to, and the British state was happy to sit back and let everybody kind of do things the way that they wanted to do them. I'm definitely trying to combat that narrative very clearly in this book. You can see that almost just through this cover. This does not look stable here. This is a political cartoon by William Hogarth, in which the city of London is burning in the 1760s. So people in the 18th century, as I argue in this book, do not see this as a stable period of all. They see this as a really divisive period in which political parties are going at it, where there are riots happening in the streets. I talk about several riots, both in Britain, like the excise crisis in London, as well as the Porteous riot in Scotland, as well as some kind of crowd actions in America as well. This is a period in which people are becoming more involved in the political process. It's a period in which ordinary people are really seeing that they have a role to play, and they actually are kind of going out and trying to overturn certain policies that they disagree with, like that excise tax in 1733 that I mentioned. So really with this project, what part of what I was trying to show is that this was not a stable period at all. Contemporaries did not view this as stable or calm or neglectful even. They saw this as an era of real political contestation in which different groups were arguing over what they wanted the British state and what they wanted the British Empire to be.
Okay, so that's great. And it seems to me that, to make that argument, you make certain choices. You
Mhm.
alluded to this a few minutes ago. One is, I think you're incredibly sensible and smart choice to focus on how people communicate with each other, right? And you have, a lot of your newspapers. It reminded me of the way that my advisor, Bernard Bailyn, looked at these pamphlets, right? That as you look at the medium, you don't, as well as, who's using it. So I like that you talk about print. But I also, and where I want to steer you at the moment is I'm curious why you made the decision to focus on the four arenas that you focus on. They're very different from each other, but they're each seems to be part of the story. So can you talk about that? Because I think yours is the first book that I know of that brings these four particular places into conversation with each other.
That's a great question. Really, like the first basic reason why I chose these case studies is because I was trying to show that this was truly a transatlantic movement. So I was very kind of deliberate about having two case studies on the British side of the Atlantic, that's England, really London more, and Scotland, and then two case studies on the American side of the Atlantic, New York and Georgia. The other thing that I was trying to do with these case studies is to highlight different aspects of the Patriots' political program. So the chapter on England focuses a lot on their militant foreign policy. The chapter on New York focuses a lot on civil liberties like trial by jury and free speech. The chapter on Georgia focuses predominantly on their imperial policy. So one thing with this project that I'm trying to show is that patriotism was in some ways a very flexible political ideology and flexible political movement. People in different areas with vastly different economic systems and political traditions could take aspects of this movement that really appealed to them and then adapt it to their own local circumstances. So there was a little bit of a method in my madness in choosing those four places.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's madness at all. I mean, I think it
Okay,
works very
great.
well. It does make me think. And I probably discussed this years ago. It seems to me that you have your patriots are this group of people who believe in. You lay out these four things they believe in, right? But in thinking over those, I'm wondering what kinds of tensions you see between sort of what I see in your book is sort of both the militant and expansionist sort of as one part, but then this idea about the confederal and freedom as not necessarily on the same, right? That these could be in tension with each other, right? That one is more about an aggressive state and the what a couple, and the other are more about weight protections from that state. I'm
Right.
just maybe I'm misreading that, but I'm just curious if you see tensions within your four category within your four the four planks of the party.
I think that there's some tension. I think that pretty much any political program, there are going to be sometimes some politically, some different ideologies that do not always cooperate very well if you're trying to create a big tent kind of party, especially. One example of this is what's happening in England, especially in the Seven Years' War, in which they do have this very militant policy, but they're also on the Patriots, led by William Pitt, are very in favor of the Seven Years' War. They're really kind of responsible almost for making it as huge as it is. They're willing to throw all of the state's coffers into supporting this war. But at the same time, they're preaching this case of we are the party of civil liberty. We are the party of constitutional values. You can see sometimes that those things might conflict with each other because to fight a big, expansive war, you need to tax the people. You also need oftentimes soldiers and sailors for this war. So part of the issue with habeas corpus is they're trying to protect and press sailors, but the Navy at the same time is like, hey, we need some sailors or else we cannot actually fight on an even playing field with the French during this period. They also have this Militia Act that I talk a little bit about, where they're trying to create this almost a kind of a contemporary National Guard, if you will, in which local Englishmen are going to fight if they actually get invaded. They have to drill every Sunday. They have to invest a lot of their time in being in this militia, and it's not voluntary. So they actually are very surprised when a lot of people in England sort of turn against this Militia Act and say, hey, I don't want to be part of a national militia. They see this as a way to protect England from standing armies, but the English people are not always as excited about that idea. So, yeah, certainly they're trying to make this work. They're trying to create a system in which they can be both militant and protecting the rights of Britons. These two values do not always work in practice.
And in your identifying these people,
Mhm.
um, they're coming together in a public. They're using newspapers, magazines to talk to each other, uh, and they're articulating these things, but they're articulating them across a very wide geographic space.
Right.
And I'm just curious, and I guess this is a question for any of us who want to deal with the intersection between ideas, and um and what I don't know what to call it, the real world, the physical world, you know, how did ideas change across the four areas that you talk about, right? Because so I'm trained as an early American historian, and I was certainly raised to think that New York and Georgia were very different kinds of places, right? In so many ways. Um, and so, and they're both very different from Scotland and England. So, how does this set of ideas that your people, that well, the Patriots, uh, how do they adapt to these different circumstances? How do they become what seems from your book kind of a big tent kind of a party?
I mean, so I think newspapers, first of all, are kind of how these ideas are oftentimes spreading in the first place. There are a lot of British newspapers that are controlled by Patriot editors. People like William Pulteney is one of the big backers of the Craftsman, which is the big Patriot newspaper in England during this time period. And then a newspaper in New York, like the New York Weekly Journal, oftentimes takes a lot of these ideas, kind of copy and paste them over into this New York journal. I tell my students that plagiarism was not really a thing in the 18th century, but that does not give them an excuse for their papers if they choose to employ this strategy. But when they get these ideas, they make them their own in various ways too. So in New York, for example, they take this kind of notion of this anti-French foreign policy, and they try to employ that against the French in the Great Lakes region and say that the opposing party is doing too much to kind of accommodate these French traders, and they're not being militant enough against them. They kind of ignore, I think, sometimes parts of the party platform that do not apply to them or that they do not find quite as appealing. So again, it's fluid, it's flexible, it's a kind of a big tent, and there's no kind of discipline as to what kinds of parts of the program different areas of the empire are going to take as their own.
So, Amy, given that, um, so your book, I mean, one of the things that really strikes me about, one of the original and really important messages that you're saying, if I'm getting this right, is that rather than thinking these people disdain the idea of parties, you're basically saying they embrace the idea of parties. Is that
I wouldn't go that far, to be honest.
okay? So how
So
far would
party,
you go? Go.
yeah, so party is kind of a bad word in the 18th
Exactly.
century.
Well, that's where I
Yeah.
was kind of wondering. Yeah. So
Sure.
please.
Yeah. So party is certainly like a party is the word that you apply to your political enemies. The word party is all over the place in the 18th century, but the Whigs are calling the Patriots a party. The Patriots are calling the Whigs a party. The Tories are calling everybody a party, I guess. So really, this is something that's derogatory. It's seen as something that caused the fall of the Roman Republic, for example, and these people are sort of obsessed with the Romans. However, I argue in my book that even if they are rejecting this label, they are actually behaving pretty clearly partisan ways. For example, the Patriots have a pretty dedicated party leadership. People like William Pulteney, James Oglethorpe, these members of parliament who really kind of make it their career to spread Patriot policies across the empire. They have very close connections with organizations like local trade organizations and urban mercantile organizations within places like London and Bristol and Liverpool. And the most important aspect that makes this partisan to me is really this press network. They have a network of newspapers and printers who are printing pamphlet after pamphlet during this time period, who really are coordinating their attacks with each other, writing letters back and forth, and are taking what works in one place and trying to use it in somewhere else. So when the excise crisis blows up in England, there are newspapers in Scotland and newspapers in New York that are both trying to get people riled up about the idea of a similar kind of tax in these places. So they are behaving in organized ways. It's not a party in the same sense that we think of party today. It's more fluid than that, really. There's not institutionalization within government. There's not a party whip or anything like that. And they're always claiming that they're not a party. The other guys are. But I do think that if we look at this, it looks like a party.
Okay. So taking that in hand, when you get through the 7 Years' War, when you get to sort of the culmination, right?
Right.
And as someone again trained on the American side of this whole situation, I'm like, oh no, Amy, go farther. Take this further. But you take us through the 7 Years' War, and is it your sense that the 7 Years' War and its resolution is a confirmation that these people, these patriots, had the right ideas, that their ideas prevail at a certain point? Not that you endorse them as I'm in favor of them, but that
Sure.
they capture the moment and that this is their moment of triumph, or is it not?
Say it's their moment of triumph, but it's their last gasp in a certain
Exactly.
ways too. Yeah. I mean, so a couple of things that are pretty important happen in the 7 Years' War. The one big one is that George II dies and his son becomes the king, or sorry, his grandson becomes the king, George III. And George III has a much more of a what I call an authoritarian, reformist kind of ideology. Also is very attached to the Tories. So he really does his best to try to turn Britain into this more kind of conservative direction at the time. That happens in the middle of the war. William Pitt, who's a hugely popular prime minister, steps down because of this. And he no after that point, the Patriots never really have domestic British political success after this. So, I mean, the Seven Years' War, in a lot of ways, is a triumph for the Patriot Party. They had been arguing that war was necessary for decades, and then they proved that they could accomplish what they set out to do, which was to defeat the French and the Spanish in a pretty definitive fashion. But also, the British domestic public, at least, they're tired of war at the end of this. They don't want to fight in the militia anymore. They don't want to pay these taxes. A lot of the political turmoil during this period associated with John Wilkes really turns a lot of people off of the Patriot movement because they begin associating patriots with turmoil and with violence in the streets and these marches and just a lot of chaos, basically. And so this is a moment in which, after this point, patriotism never has as much power within domestic Britain as it had in the 1750s and early 60s. In America, on the other hand, patriotism is as popular as it has ever been. So you can see that as a really dividing moment in which there are geographic divisions starting in terms of which political ideology people begin to embrace. Up until this point, the patriots on both sides of the Atlantic looked like they had a good chance of seizing power.
Okay, so that's fascinating, right? So I'm like, my question is then why? Why this kind of division with Americans, whoever these Americans are? That's a term I find a complicated term, who are the Americans, but who the Americans on one side embracing it and people in Britain moving away. So why?
I mean, one big reason is that the conclusion of the Seven Years' War helps Americans quite a lot. I mean, the British Americans have been dealing with this French threat for the entirety of British America's existence, basically. And suddenly that French threat disappears. So they see this as a real triumph of patriot ideology, and William Pitt in particular. William Pitt is this hero in America at the end of the Seven Years' War, and especially the Stamp Act crisis. There are portraits of William Pitt all over the place. There are statues erected to William Pitt. James Otis sends a letter to him saying that idolatry would not be too strong a word about how Americans feel about him. But it's also at this moment that more kind of conservative authoritarian reformer group comes in power in Britain, and they begin actually employing these policies in the American colonies that they had been promoting for a long time. The most important of these policies is basically that we need to tax the colonies and that we need to have a more hierarchical, disciplined empire. This goes against everything that the Patriots stood for. It obviously hurts Americans more than it hurts to people within domestic Britain. So the end of the war is kind of this moment in which there is two different paths that the two different regions take. But it didn't have to be that way. If people in domestic Britain had supported this patriot movement in the 1760s and 70s and beyond, I think you can make a really good case that the American Revolution would not have happened, or at least would not have happened right then. So this wasn't inevitable. It definitely had to do with political choices that people are making.
So a long time ago, um, when Balin was writing Ideological Origins, he was saying that this earlier political tradition from early 18th century England became compelling to the revolutionaries in the 60s into the 70s because it began to explain what they saw and led them in a certain direction. That direction, well, what timing towards independence.
Right.
In your mind, is that what the Patriots are doing? Are the Patriots is the reason that there's this kind of fracture between what happens in America and what happens in Britain? Did the Patriots, the way they talked, the way they articulated their issues, did they give the language that revolutionaries would use at the same time that they're now causing, maybe because of the accession of the George III, causing tensions on the other side of the Britain? I'm just trying to understand the long-term legacy of their set of ideas.
Yeah, I think that the long-term legacy is a strong one. I will say, though, I mean, I very much see myself as building upon Balin's work, and this ideological origins is very foundational to the way that I think through this period. But the original people who are writing these writings that are seen as the ideological origins, people like William Pulteney and Bolingbroke and the Craftsman, Cato's letters, these people are not revolutionaries. I want to make that clear. They very much see themselves as loyalists to the British state. They see themselves as patriots again. They're being patriotic and trying to influence Britain in going this particular direction. And they think of Britain and America as inextricably intertwined. They want to create a stronger, more prosperous British Empire, in which America is very much a part of that. They don't want independence at all. However, I do think that these ideas do influence the revolutionaries in certain ways when Britain starts going this other direction with people like George III and George Grenville and the Tories. They see this as oppression because the patriot ideas have trained them to see this as oppression. I was looking at the Declaration of Independence for a class the other week, and if you look at those grievances in the Declaration, it's basically just kind of a little précis of the Patriot Party platform in the early 18th century. They're complaining about the same things that the Patriots had been complaining about Robert Walpole and later with George Grenville and Lord North. They're complaining about things like just dissolving colonial assemblies, like this kind of idea that there should be less power in colonial courts and colonial legislatures. They're complaining about taxes, obviously. That's a huge issue for the Patriots throughout the 18th century. They're complaining about immigration, which is another aspect of the Patriots platform that I didn't really get a chance to talk about too much in this book. But yeah, I mean, they're taking these ideas and they're making them their own, and they're bringing them in a direction that the original British Patriots would never have wanted them to bring, which was independence. But certainly these ideas do influence them.
Okay. I want to open it up soon to the audience, but I want to ask you one more kind of.
Okay, great.
So you've written this book, and it's just Amy, it's so beautifully written. The
Thank you.
research is really phenomenal. The geographic framing is imaginative. You're not dealing with a small issue, you're dealing with kind of a central issue of how I understand politics in the 18th century. It's all great. So my question is, and your comment about the Declaration made me even more interested in this. What comes next? Do you write volume 2, 1763 to independence? Or you're like, I've done enough with these people, I'm moving in a different direction? Because I do think there is a story to be told. You've built them up to their moment of success. And then as a reader, as an Amy Watson reader, I want to know, how do you then tell the next part of the story? But maybe that's not where you want to go with your work. So
I mean, it certainly is something I've thought about because I do think that you could do a volume 2 of the Patriots during the Revolution, and especially what happens to people like William Pitt and Isaac Barre and these people who are still alive during the Revolutionary period. I mean, I've been playing around with a lot of different ideas for a second book. I think I have like too many ideas. I'm not sure which ones are good and which ones are not yet. I mean, one of them is actually the idea that I kind of mentioned with this Declaration of Independence, which is looking at debates over immigration during the 18th century and the fact that there are all these immigration schemes happening, to things like trying to promote the resettlement of Palatine refugees in America. There are debates over naturalization that end up having a lot of political turmoil, like the Jewish Naturalization Act in the 1750s. So that's another direction I was thinking about going as well, is looking at what role immigration and debates and politics about that might have played in this 18th century moment, which then again is inscribed in the Declaration of Independence. But yeah, I could tell a volume 2 of the Patriots too, what the Patriots, and especially the British Patriots, are doing in the Revolution itself. It might be a little bit more of a sad story, I guess. They're obviously not the winners in this conflict. They see this empire that they very much want to be prosperous and strong being dismantled in the 1770s and 80s, but that might be an interesting story to tell too.
well, I would just say, not to get political about the moment, but if someone in retrospect writes history of our era and looks at the two major parties, I'd say both of them are sad stories.
Yes, yes.
So I mean, it's the nature of, political organization and parties, that certain visions are difficult to sustain. But anyway, that's a political discussion we can get into separately. Amy, do you want me to field the questions, or you want me to do it? Who do you want me to do it?
You're welcome to. I
All right.
can ask people.
Mark Hanna, go. And
Hi, Mark.
please use the raised hand function like Mark did with this great model. So, okay, Mark, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hey, Mark.
Okay.
Good to see you.
Uh, Good to see you too. So I've been following this project for a long time. I've read the book. It's fantastic. I'm going to first make a comment, which is I taught a class in the spring called The Age of Atlantic Revolutions, which basically tries to talk about all these revolutions, the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, Latin American revolutions, in these huge, broader sort of geographic terms. And one of the things that your work influenced me on is I made habeas corpus one of the sort of central themes.
Oh,
And
that's great.
essentially, because you make me think about this all the time. And it was a thing that every time essentially you saw someone talking about habeas corpus, all of a sudden Charles the First is dead, right? I mean, every time it got brought up as a thing that got threatened, you had these revolutionary moments. So you really influenced me deeply on this. And
Oh, thanks, Mike.
one of the problems with that, of course, is everyone's warning us to be very careful about talking about politics, modern politics in class. And so I'll tell you my strategy with that was, as various things were going down with the present, political parties, my assignments consisted of telling my students to just Google habeas corpus. And then they would come into class, and I wouldn't say anything, and they would come into class and say, "Can I talk about what I saw when I Googled habeas corpus?" And eventually, it was every week somebody trying to say habeas corpus is overrated and should we take it away. Um, so yeah, that's just my comment about how influential I
Well, the
think.
British Patriots would have been very sad about that. The British Patriots
Yeah,
very much supported habeas corpus, and the American Patriots, for that matter.
and some large numbers of people think it's very unimportant right now. So it's very influential. The one thing I would say that there's many things that are sort of groundbreaking in this project. One of the, I think, most significant is the reframing. So obviously, all of a sudden, you're thinking, how is it that Jefferson and Adams shared the same beliefs? They're totally different. One lives in a plantation, the other is essentially living in a merchant community. They come from totally different family backgrounds, but they share. But you're sort of saying, well, yeah, of course, but actually, they share these politics that you didn't know about Americanists because it had been going on for years. And I just want to ask, like, even though I'm giving a big statement, a small question, which is, in what ways do you see yourself in this book highlighting events that maybe because of reframing that an Americanist might not have ever talked about or thought it was important, like the War of Jenkins' Ear? I just want to ask about that one small thing, because when you give the lectures on surveys of early American history, your vast majority would say, like, yeah, it was this war with a weird name, it's unimportant. But you're sort of saying, well, actually, some of these events are actually a really big deal in the bigger picture. And can you just talk about, like, that is just one example of reframing?
Yeah, no, thanks so much for the kind comments. Obviously your work has influenced me a ton as well. I actually taught your well-behaved pirates article in my class yesterday because we're doing Pirate Week in my class this week. Yeah, I mean,
Hold on,
certainly,
let me tell you that wasn't Peter's edited volume. So I have to
yes,
give
yeah. So
Peter
Peter
so.
was involved with that as well. Exactly. Everyone's here. This is great, seeing all these people who've influenced me in one space. Yeah, I think certainly I do want Americanists to recognize that British party politics mattered. The War of Jenkins' Ear is a great example of that. One very just kind of silly, simple one that Steve Pincus actually brings up in his book, Heart of the Declaration, is that Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, is named after Admiral Vernon, who was this great naval commander in the War of Jenkins' Ear, who got victory at Portobello and kind of raised all the British patriotic fervors during this era, in which they're naming everything after Portobello, including some pubs that you can still visit in England to this day. And George Washington's father, I believed, was part of this squadron and then ended up naming his plantation after Admiral Vernon. So you can see that these early American patriots are, these revolutionaries are influenced by the history of these British patriots as well. These are people they see as part of the same movement and as foundational to the ideas that they want to create in creating a new nation. So thanks, Mark.
Okay, I'm just going to go in the order that things are popping up. Please use the react button at the bottom to raise the hand because it's easier for me to see that than people sort of trying to get my attention. So, Lindsay, you are next. Lindsay O'Neill, please.
Thanks, Peter. Hey, Amy. So really happy this book's out. And I always find it really interesting to hear about kind of the writing process and pulling books together. So I'm just curious, can you just talk about like what did you think was one of the biggest challenges of doing this book? Was it trying to decide on the geographic parameters? Is it, was it how you put things in order? Like what challenges did you face when you were kind of doing this that, you had to grapple with?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lindsay, for being here. There are always challenges, especially when it's a first book and you don't know what you're doing quite yet. I would say that how expansive this project was really a bit of a challenge to me. And in particular, there's a lot of historiographies that I suddenly had to become somewhat adept with very, very quickly. Any of you who are Americanists know that there really, for the colonial period, there's a historiography of every single colony during this era. So that was a lot to tackle. And I certainly got called out sometimes when I was trying to publish articles about this project that I had missed very foundational historiographical literature, but it wasn't because I was trying to ignore those people. It was really just that I was trying to kind of give myself a primer on so many different regions of the empire very, very quickly. So that was certainly a challenge. Narrowing down the case studies was a challenge too. I thought very seriously about including Jamaica in this project and very seriously about including Ireland in the project as well. So I did a lot of research on certain aspects of Ireland and Jamaica that did not end up in the book, obviously. But I do think that it was a learning process and trying to figure out how to frame this and which case studies to look at. And that was good for me. I got to learn a lot about a lot of different regions really quickly and realized that I could kind of tackle this and that I could at least get what I needed about a particular region and try to make connections between different regions. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks. Okay, Sean Sullivan.
Yes, hello. Mike's working good. Yes. All right. Cool. Hi, Amy. Really interesting. I regret that I have not read the entirety of the book yet. I've been relying on a Google Doc that has like half the pages cut out right now, so I apologize if I'm like skipping over things. But I was interested about your work in the context of sort of a set of books within wider Revolutionary War or War of Independence historiography that have come out in the last like 2 decades. I'm thinking of like McConville's The King's Three Faces, Nelson's The Royalist Revolution, Andrew Roberts. Andrew Roberts' big biography of George III came out a couple of years ago. And what drew me to your work was I was interested in the role of royalism within the Patriot movement and how it starts to disintegrate during the imperial crisis. Because thinking to like the Albany Plan of 1757 and sort of the later like kind of desperate turn to the crown petitions in like the 1770s, like the plan drawn up by Galloway, Jefferson's proposal in 74, it feels as though there's still that lingering what I guess we might call patriot sentiment in this idea of kind of like a early sort of Commonwealth arrangement with the British Crown between the American colonies and maintaining those links. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the role of royalism, both under George II and then later under George III, or early in George III's reign, with this patriot movement you identify in the early 18th century and the degree to which the movement interacts with it and might strain against it.
Yeah, certainly. That's a great question. Like I said, I'm actually teaching this in one of my classes next week, so that was very like fitting that I totally agree. Certainly, royalism is part of what the Patriots are preaching during the 18th century. They very much see them as being the ones who are standing in favor of the British state and the British monarchy. They view Robert Walpole and the Whigs, who were in charge for much of this time period, as kind of being the corrupt advisors who are kind of trying to distort the monarchy in various ways. And a little bit of that is probably political fiction. You're allowed to attack the prime minister in a way that you are not allowed to attack the monarch during this time period. That is seen as treasonous and kind of beyond the pale. John Wilkes, who is a British patriot, ends up getting in a lot of trouble in the North Britain because he actually does attack the monarch a little bit more directly, and that is not perceived as what you do during this time period. So yeah, some of it I think could be political fictions and trying to do this in a politically acceptable way. But I do think that the Patriots, up until really almost the very, very point of revolution itself, do find themselves very attached to the idea of monarchy. If you read Patriot newspapers, they're following what is happening in the royal court all of the time. They are very interested in these monarchical birthdays and things of that nature. And one interesting thing about the Patriots is they oftentimes attach themselves not to the monarch himself, but to the Prince of Wales, actually. So a lot of Patriots kind of create almost the shadow court around Prince Frederick, who should have been the next king of Britain, but died before he could accede to the throne. And they're kind of almost shadow ministers to him. So you have people like Lord Grange, who's almost the Scottish minister. You have people who are writing pamphlets on behalf of Frederick. So yeah, they do not see monarchy as opposed to patriotism at all. Really, they are hoping to kind of create this new British state in which they have who they perceive as a patriotic monarch in charge. First, they hope that person is going to be Frederick. He dies. Then George III comes to the throne. And that's actually a moment of hope for a lot of them. But obviously, George III ends up having very different political beliefs than what most of them adhere to. So that is one, I think, moment of separation with the monarchy. But yeah, they're not anti-monarchy until really they have to be, in which they've embraced the idea of revolution.
Yeah, and that seems to gel with what I've otherwise read. I guess my interest is more in how, or I guess it's just an interest I have to find myself, is the point at which that really breaks down. 'Cause going through Robert's biography of George III, of course, George, portrays himself as the Patriot King. He takes this influence from Bolingbroke and Bute
Right.
of emphasizing the king's role in the colonies as part of this wider imperial project. And I guess part of the curiosity is, what really is the issue that finally separates the idea of George from being the Patriot King from the Patriot cause as a whole? Because certainly
That's a
going
good
through the imperial
question.
crisis with the gradual problems over taxes, it becomes more of a problem internal to the colonies and a disconnect between the colonies themselves and the idea of the wider imperial project.
Right. I mean, I don't have a grade. I wish I could like pinpoint like
Yeah,
1768 is when they decided that monarchy was no longer for them. Really, this book ends in 1763 and a little bit 1765. So by the point that the book has ended, they are still pro-monarchy, but they're beginning to realize that George III is not the monarch that they hoped that he
Right.
would be. So it's kind of a moment right before that break. That's a great
Thank you.
question.
Thank you.
James Jackson. James Jackson.
Hey, I'm not as knowledgeable on the subject. I saw this. I'm a student at UAB.
Great.
I haven't read the book. I am very interested now after hearing about this discussion of transatlantic revolutions and the Patriots. I wanted to ask, when you discussed the anti-French sentiment around the Seven Years' War, it got me thinking of the charges of being Jacobins placed upon the Democratic Republicans in the 1790s, and I remember doing some newspaper research for that. So I was wondering, more on a larger level, what are some of the continuities you see in the Patriots before and in the American politics with the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists after the Revolution?
Thanks so much for coming, James. Great to have UAB students here. That's a great question. It's one that, to be honest, I should do more work on in order to kind of like play out these connections. Certainly, I think the Patriot politics do not exactly correspond with later kind of what is perceived as more radical Jacobin politics. Patriots, at the end of the day, again, were like very pro-monarchy. Very like they claimed that they were going to be the ones who were going to bring this era of prosperity and stability into the British Empire. However, certainly I would argue that the Patriots are not democratic exactly, but they are more democratizing. They are a group that cares very much about having ordinary people play a role in politics. Oftentimes just kind of as a check on what they think of as authoritarian government. And so that idea of kind of giving some power to the people and that people should be allowed to protest and march in the streets and have a role to say in government and popular sovereignty, I do think you could certainly trace some connections between this British Patriot movement and later revolutionary groups like the French Jacobins. But that seems like a great book that somebody should write someday. I think that would be really interesting.
Volume 3, Amy. Volume 3.
Volume 3, we got it. We got it done.
Arthur Williamson, were you trying to? I couldn't tell if you're trying to get my attention. You're muted. Um, I can't hear you.
Can you
maybe try
hear
to
me now?
Now,
Yes,
yes, now we
yes.
can hear you.
Okay, this has been a bit of a struggle technically, and it normally isn't, so my apologies. I had a different sort of question, Amy. The term patriot and people calling themselves patriots dates from the late 16th century and very prominently from the 1570s. And people had continued from that time to call themselves in the Anglophone world, very clearly from the 1580s, patriots. And I was wondering, your people emerging seemingly rather suddenly in the early 18th century, uh, it's hard to imagine they were not aware of their predecessors and what that term meant and the kind of ideological or policy-based baggage that might come with it. So my question is, where do patriots come from? Patriotism would be far too abstract for people in the 16th and much of the 17th century. That term wouldn't be used. Maybe in the 18th century, I'm not sure. But patriots are not new, but are you
Right.
patriots new?
I mean, I think that they are certainly drawing from some of these older, oftentimes kind of like Republican, more traditions, especially from the 17th century. They are careful not to call themselves Republican because that is something, again, they are pro-monarchy. They want to be perceived as British loyalists. I really argue in the book that even if they're drawing from these earlier moments, like the 16th and 17th centuries, and these more Republican ideas and ideas of popular sovereignty,
Mhm.
they are, as an organization, they really kind of come into their own moment in the 18th century, and they're really embracing this term very consciously. So I argue that oftentimes that the word patriot for them is a little bit of a piece of political marketing, that this is for the most part perceived favorably in the 18th century. So by calling themselves patriots, they're also accusing the Whigs, who they stand opposed of being unpatriotic. They're saying we, unlike the Whig Party, are acting for the best interest of the country. We are acting for the interest of the British people and the British state as a whole, whereas the Whigs are just trying to line their pockets. The Whigs are self-enriching. And so by calling themselves patriots, it's also kind of an accusation against the Whigs for being unpatriotic. Certainly, like a lot of these ideas from these earlier periods that you're talking about, they're aware of, they are associated with them, but they are not necessarily in every respect seeing themselves as the inheritors of that tradition.
Okay. A lot of people did. And so you're saying, if I understand you, Amy, a real disjuncture. The word is the same, but what's involved in the mix is really quite different.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, it's distinctive to the 18th century. I mean, patriot people have called themselves patriots in the same way that people call themselves patriots today sometimes. It's like we are the ones who are in favor of the country.
mhm.
Irish in the 1790s, there's an Irish patriot movement, which shares a
Yes.
few similarities with the British patriot movement, but it's its own distinctive thing as well. It doesn't have exactly the same goals. So I do think that this can be like a very fluid label and one that is a positive label that the patriots are taking in order to try to market themselves to the British people.
Yeah, originally it was you could be a patriot without necessarily being a Catholic or a Protestant, or you could come from different groups, and it had a bridging effect. And I'm wondering whether that might also be the case with the 18th century.
Certainly there are a lot of people who call themselves patriots in the 18th century. Some of them come from a more Tory tradition. At the beginning of my book, I'm talking a bit about the patriots and their alliance with the Tories. So they're kind of
Mhm.
patriot Whigs and patriot Tories. So certainly that would be a bit of a bridge. They oftentimes call themselves the country party as well. And they're saying that we, unlike the Whigs, are operating we're representing the people, we're operating for the best of the country, and we're trying to bridge these partisan divides in order order to do that. However, that alliance breaks. That coalition, I would argue, around the 1740s, it really does split apart because ideologically, the Tories and the Patriots do not share all of the same ideas, especially about things like religious policy. The Tories are very careful about wanting to promote the interests of the Church of England. The Patriots, that's not as big of a concern for them. And in fact, they tend to be a little bit more tolerationist, at least towards religious dissenters. So yeah, there's a bit of a bridging language with patriots, but these more radical patriots, these radical Whigs from this Whig tradition that I'm talking about in this book, they keep the label a little bit longer than these more Tory-leaning patriots. So by the 1760s, if you're talking about a patriot, you'd mean somebody like John Wilkes, who certainly is not a Tory, is very much opposed to Lord Bute. By the time you get to the American Revolution, they're using this language to talk about this more radical tradition, not the more kind of conservative patriots of the past. But yeah, it's a label a lot of people are trying to use during this time period. And when I'm using it in the book, I'm really talking about this more kind of radical strain of patriotism.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Are there other questions? I'm not seeing.
We've got just if I can interrupt you one sec, we do have a question in the
Please.
chat, and I'll just read it out so we have a chance. Dave asks, Thomas Kiemer in his Poetics of the Pillory indicated that the lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695 was not fundamental because it was superseded by action against seditious libel, which seems to subvert both Plum and perhaps Habermas. Was it deployed in North America to restrain discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, this is actually like one of the big topics in my chapter on New York is looking at this issue of free speech. The governor in New York, Cosby, does try to restrain speech through this policy of using these seditious libel trials. So the newspaper I'm really looking at in that chapter is the New York Weekly Journal, and it basically becomes kind of an organ for this patriot opposition in New York to criticize what they perceive as the authoritarian actions of Cosby. They do try to sue this newspaper time and time again, a pretty famous libel case, the John Peter Zinger case, who was their printer. And eventually, Zinger is acquitted at trial, essentially because of jury nullification. The New Yorkers agree with his criticisms of Cosby, even though by the standards of the 1730s, this newspaper did kind of commit what they considered to be libel at that time. So certainly, like there's still, even though censorship is a big issue in the 18th century, Robert Walpole's trying to do this a lot over in England as well. Walpole is trying to sue the Craftsman quite a bit and other patriot journals as well. And so this is a debate, like even if people are allowed to publish freely, how much are they actually allowed to publish? What is the line in terms of criticizing the government? Is it okay to criticize the prime minister? Is it okay to criticize the king? These are definitely questions that are still being worked out in this period.
Okay. Well, Amy.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
Peter.
sorry.
Can I
John,
throw in
go
a quick-
ahead. John Van Sant, please.
Okay, I just want to throw in a quick question. Amy, great discussion, and great to hear you talk about your book. For those of you who don't know, I'm one of Amy's colleagues in the UAB Department of History, but I teach mostly Asia and world history. I just have a quick question. The ideas of the patriots that you talk about in this book, do they in any way perhaps date back to say John Locke of 80, 90 years previous, or are these more of a contemporaneous concern, the 1750s and the 1760s?
Certainly, they see themselves as Lockean in a lot of ways. The Whigs do too. So these two different parties are both trying to claim kind of Locke as their own. But they see him as one of these people who's really kind of creating this contract theory that they do sort of believe in, that there should be that popular sovereignty is important, that the rights of the people are important, and that the state needs to protect those. So this idea of civil liberty, a lot of them do embrace that, and they see themselves oftentimes as true Whigs. So they think that Robert Walpole and the current Whig parties are not behaving in the way that Whigs should be. And so using this label of patriot is kind of a way to divorce themselves from what they see as contemporary Whigs, but they still embrace the policies of the Whig platform from the late 17th century. Thanks, John.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end. Amanda, did you want to jump in here on behalf of NACBS?
Yes, I would just like to thank both of you. This was a great discussion and everyone had such wonderful questions. I want to send a thanks to Amy and to Peter. And we have 2 more of these events, I think, before our meeting in November. So if you're interested or enjoyed the talk, check out our schedule. But otherwise, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Amy and Peter for today's event.
Thanks all of you for being here. I very much appreciate it.
Great talking to you, Amy. I look forward to it next time being in person.
Yeah, I hope next time I get to see you in LA pretty soon. That would be fun.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you.